切，北京嘅天氣咁鬼差。
香港人都好现实哦。
台湾人一天到晚在选举。
打破刻板印象，
透视两岸三地，
无评论不新闻
三地话新闻。各位，你正在收听的是凤凰 U Radio 综合台每周一到周五中午12点到1点钟在香港直播的三地话新闻。大家好，我是樊素，
我是春雨，
我是圆圆。
这几天的国际新闻最热的恐怕除了是 APEC 在北京开幕之外呢，就是美国的中期选举了。美国的中期选举呢，在当地时间的4号落下帷幕，投票呢已经全部完成，计票工作呢也接近尾声。民主党人奥巴马遭遇了滑铁卢，他所在的民主党呢是获得了45席，那共和党呢在参议院呢是以52席占优，在众议院方面呢，共和党更加是以235席大幅领先，民主党只是获得了185席。这些数字意味着什么呢？就是美国的国会将呈现共和党一统天下的政治格局，全面掌控两院，奥巴马成为真正的跛脚鸭总统，他的任期还剩2年，恐怕接下来2年的执政将会面临到重大的挫折。
其实共和党取得前胜，这里边也有咱们华人的身影，有一位华裔的政治新星，在美国可谓是非常的年轻，也非常的闪目夺目啊，就是陈仁仪，他是一个36岁的台湾裔的美国华裔，然后呢，他2次担任共和党总统候选人罗姆尼的这个竞选总部政策主任，被之前的劳工部部长赵小兰说他是正在创造美国华裔参政的历史的一个人物。其实我们也非常有幸对他进行了一个专访，他真的是非常非常的年轻有为，36岁就拿到了4个哈佛的学位，我真的是非常敬佩他。到底是什么让他最终取得了这样的成就？其实我们也可以从接下来的采访中听到答案。
其实日前呢，我们的执行台长于莹小姐是专门对这样一位美国政坛的新星进行了一次专访。除了她30岁刚刚博士毕业就进入罗姆尼的核心竞选团队之外呢，她还是少有的进入美国政策核心圈的亚裔，尤其是在白人占多数的共和党。那么紧接着我们就来听到这段专访。首先我们也非常好奇她的个人成长经历到底是什么样的，为什么他会跟众多的华裔这么不一样，他会对政治有这么大的热情。
Nahi, welcome to Phoenix in Hong Kong today. It's
Thank
such
you.
a pleasure to have you with us.
It's good to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. When I first knew about you, I couldn't stop being amazed at how young you were. You were very young when you already reached the highest echelon in U.S. elite politics. We all say that in a large part, our parents make us into who we are. And what kind of values do your parents instill in you?
Well, I think my parents always emphasized the value of good education, hard work. And I think those are the kinds of things that for me have always been important in my own career. Obviously, I spent a lot of time in school, so I think that was important. But obviously, they're also very persistent people, and I think being persistent is also important when you're thinking about being involved in an industry that there aren't very many Asians involved in the U.S., like politics.
Was going to politics something that they want you to go into?
No, they never actually had anything to do with politics. You know, they were very focused. My dad's a doctor. My mother was a chemist by training, and then later went on to run his business. And so I think they were always very focused on other things. So the politics was never an interest of theirs. So for me, I was sort of the first one in the family to go the political route. And so I think they were always very supportive, but they didn't really know what it would involve.
But did they want you to become like doctors or, businessmen or other Asian path?
I think they felt like being a doctor would be a great stable life for me. And I think they would have been happy if I chose that. But they also weren't necessarily pushing me in that direction either.
And you earned 4 degrees from Harvard. That's a lot of studying. What were you thinking?
I don't know what I was thinking. I always figured that I wanted to practice law at some point in my life, so I went to Harvard Law School, and then I also thought, well, I'd love to teach too, and obviously to teach at the university level, meaning a PhD. and so I went to get the PhD as well. But I really did enjoy my time at Harvard. Cambridge is a wonderful place, as you know, from having spent some time there. It's really great, and so I developed a good network of friends in the area, and really enjoyed my time there.
So you started liking politics way before Harvard then?
Way before, yeah. I liked politics. I remember memories of watching Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush when they were presidents, watching them on TV. And
were they your inspirational leaders?
Yeah, thinking they were inspirational, but also that they were really making a difference. And for me, politics and involvement in public policy is a lot about impacting people's lives in the U.S. And so I was always inspired by people like Reagan and Bush and others, and so I developed the interest very early on.
Yeah, you say you're from California. A lot of Californians, so do immigrants, are Democrats.
Yes.
How did you become so rooted in Republican philosophies?
I really feel strongly about the value of individual responsibility and the fact that individuals, not government, are what's made America the country it is today. And those are really fundamental to what Republicans believe. I think there's been a lot of attention paid to areas where Republicans disagree, for example, on social policy around same-sex marriage or abortion. And certainly those are issues that a lot of people can disagree on. But at core, my political philosophy has always been driven by the issues of, as I said, responsibility, less government, value of promoting U.S. businesses, for example. And those are all things that I think are Republican strengths.
What kind of leader do you aspire to be?
Well, I think it's important for a leader to understand the value of working for the best interests of the people they represent. And that can be tough to discern sometimes. But I try to be as direct and as honest, obviously, as I can be. And I think that those are important traits for a leader. It's one of the reasons why I really enjoyed working for Governor Romney, because he was a man of great integrity and who really sort of said what he meant. And I think not enough people realize that about him. But I did. I got to work with him, and so that was something that I valued.
But serving one's country requires a lot of sacrifice. Is your family supportive of you going into politics?
Yeah, they are. And I think you're right. You can't do it if your family's not supportive.
Privacy, hard work, a lot of flying around.
Right. But I mean, I think we live our lives in a way where we have nothing to be ashamed of and nothing to hide. And I think that's important in politics, particularly in the U.S. now. You have to be prepared for
everything is transparent.
Exactly. The public spotlight's always going to be on you. And so that's something that I think we're prepared for and ready to accept.
But you have two very young children, though, I know.
We do.
How would you rank yourself on the good dad scale?
Well, I'd like to think that I've been a really good dad since the campaign ended. In particular, when I was working for Governor Romney, the schedule was very tough, and we had one child at the time. We now have two. But we really love spending time with our kids. And one of the great things about my schedule now that I spend most of my time at Stanford teaching is that we do get to spend a lot of time with them, and that part's a lot of fun.
好，我们刚才听到的是本台的执行台长于莹小姐，也可以说是对她的这个校友了啊，哈佛校友进行的一段专访。这位校友呢，非常的年轻，有为共和党的新星。他现在的一个身份呢是这个胡佛研究所的研究员，也是斯坦福大学公共政策项目的讲师，以及国内政策的研究主任，同时也在斯坦福的法学院任教。可以说呢，非常的有这个政治前途。是吧？
真的是学霸呀，年轻有为，4个学位，
哈佛的学位。
对，现在在斯坦福教书，真的是双福，让我真的是觉得太敬仰了。而且我发现一个很有意思的一点，就比如说你在国内你看到的学霸或者学神，你听到他们的传闻之后就销声匿迹了，很少有人会通过这种形式来给社会发声，大多都是忙于自己的小家或者是赚钱。但是我觉得在美国，你就会发现很多这个年轻人，他们在读了很多书之后，他们更多的是出来做这些能够给社会带来改变的一些政策。其实他刚才谈话中他就说，他看到的走上从政之路是因为受到了布什和里根的一些影响嘛，然后他说他们当时的一些政策确实改变了美国的社会，所以我觉得确实这可能是中外的这个学霸一些思维和 方向上的一些特别大的一个不同。
圆圆，你对他的经历什么印象？
我看他，我觉得他是一个非常典型的，就是亚裔华人在美国这个奋斗的第二代的一个典型代表。他刚才也讲了，他父母都是专业人士，父亲是医生，母亲是
化学家，
他自己开自己的公司。对，然后呢，当然他也说，当时这个父母希望他可以以后也是做医生或者做这种专业人士嘛，这种职业比较稳定，收入也比较稳定。但是他自己在这个很小的时候，就在中学的时候就已经开始对这个政治感兴趣了。然后就像刚才春雨说，他这个通过看电视看这个里根和老布什，他是如何改变当时美国现状的。因为当时里根的时候也是经济危机嘛，里根也是大刀阔斧做出了很多改革，然后改变了这个人民的生活。我觉得他其实是一个很热血的年轻人，然后再加上他的确是，我觉得一定能够在这个 Harvard 读4个学位，然后30岁就已经博士毕业的人，他应该是一个头脑非常好使、头脑非常清楚的人。包括他在 Romney 的这个2次竞选 ，Romney 选过2次总统嘛，2008
年和
2012年，
对，
他负责的是什么呢？他负责的是大家觉得最头疼的这个公共医疗的这个部分，就是 Obamacare 的搞的那些东西，那个东西是非常复杂的，就是足见这个人的脑子是非常清楚的。
我们一再的讲到跟罗姆尼的这个友谊哈，其实也是我们对他的这个专访是最为感兴趣的这个部分。那当时2012年呢，我们知道罗姆尼最后是败给了寻求连任的奥巴马。那大家也非常好奇他是怎么样正式成为竞选总部的政策主任，他跟这个罗姆尼的关系是怎么样建立起来的？现在2个人还有联系吗？再来听听下一段访问。我们3D 话新闻稍后休息，等会儿继续来回到今天的专访当中。欢迎回来，今天的3D 话新闻，我是樊素，
我是春雨，
我是圆圆。
我们继续今天对于美国政坛的华裔新星陈仁仪的专访。那陈仁仪呢，我们刚才强调的他的一个最主要的一段经历，可能就是跟罗姆尼的这段竞选的经历助选的经历。那他怎么样跟罗姆尼建立起来这种相互信任的关系？那他现在跟罗姆尼在于政策方面和对于其他的甚至人生方面，到底还能够带给我们些什么样的启示？我们马上来继续聆听本台执行台长于莹 Carol 对这位陈仁仪先生的访问。
You know, your first and foremost identity is American, but you are of, Taiwanese descent and Chinese descent. Do you think that, through your political career, your Chinese American background has helped or hindered you along the way?
I don't know that it's done either. I think, particularly in Republican Party politics in the U.S., it's a very merit-driven system. And so I tend to think that actually, people haven't seen me as Chinese or Asian. They've sort of seen me as someone who, if anything, they affiliate me more with Harvard or with schools I've been to or been a part of than anything else. I think that it hasn't been a positive or a negative. I think it's just been one of those things where people on the outside will talk about it, and people, obviously in the Asian American community will note it. And I don't resist that. I just think that it's not a big factor.
And I guess the Chinese just notice it because they're so proud of any, Chinese Americans being in the limelight, sort of in the center of the stage.
Well, we need more of that in America. And it's something that I believe very strongly in. I talk about the value of mentorship and in helping the next generation of Asian American political leaders to become part of the U.S. political system. And it should be a source of great pride when people of Chinese heritage or Taiwanese heritage or Korean heritage or Japanese heritage are able to achieve something in the U.S. political system, but it's also a sign of how open the U.S. political system is, that all these different people from all these different places can get involved.
Yes. But I guess as Chinese American, then you see in the U.S. that people are quite divided among the party lines, and people are quite divided among themselves. 内耗 is something that we always describe the Chinese community. They're not as united. How do you think this group can exert more influence in the political arena in the U.S.?
Well, part of it is some issues are going to be more important to the Chinese American and Asian American community in the U.S. than others. And so part of it is getting activated around issues that they care about. So affirmative action is a good example of this in the U.S. There's traditionally been an effort to help underrepresented minorities in college admissions by giving them some racial or ethnic preference. Now, Asians obviously don't benefit from this because there are a lot of Asians in U.S. universities and some of the top U.S. universities for that matter. And so I think that when there was an effort recently in California to reinstate affirmative action, a number of Chinese Americans got very upset by this. And so they got very active in the political process. So I think part of it is they have to identify issues that they care about. But the other part of it is seeing other Chinese Americans or seeing other Asian Americans involved in politics gets them motivated to get involved.
Yeah, at least there's some hope, right?
That I think so.
If you work hard, that you can get there eventually.
Yeah, I mean, there's a belief in the value of a merit-based system, which is what we have in the U.S., and it's nice to actually see that be the case sometimes, and not just talk, but actually, if you work hard and you play by the rules, you can actually get something accomplished.
And just like you too, you're from just a regular family, second generation immigrants, and through merits, now you've already, are one of the most successful Chinese Americans in U.S. politics.
Well, I appreciate that, and it is a testament to the U.S. system. But it also means that people can replicate the same thing. They can work hard and set up networks for themselves and really emphasize how they want to be involved in politics, and they can do great things in the U.S.
You're only 36 now. What's next for you?
Well, I would love to serve in a senior capacity in a Republican administration, if there's one, hopefully soon. And I've also started to think a little bit about potentially turning my career toward elective politics in the U.S., which can be complicated, requires a lot of deliberation and thought, but it's something that I'm starting to think a little more about. I live in California. It's a state that I think has a lot of problems, and so it's something that I'm very motivated by to try and fix some of those things.
What traits do you think have helped get you to where you are today?
I think, as I mentioned earlier with my parents, I think persistence is really important. And I think it's important to place an emphasis on establishing a goal and really working toward getting there and not taking no for an answer. I think too many times, and this is not just the case with Chinese Americans or people of Asian descent, but generally people, they sort of, when roadblocks come up or things that prevent them from making progress, they sort of shrink back, when really the reality is they have to kind of press on and work even harder. And I think that that's an important value if one wants to get anywhere in life.
Yeah. But with nothing to start with, what do you advise people to do to establish the network that's necessary to get you to where you are?
Yeah, part of what I tell people is, first of all, it's really important to pick mentors. And they don't have to be people that look like you. They can be people that don't look like you. But pick people that you think really have done things in their lives that you want to do. And really figure out a way to engage with those people, figure out a way to have them help you in what you're trying to do. And really, you yourself have to be able to talk about what it is that your goals are and really be able to articulate those. I think that's very important. So articulating what you want, but also finding people who can help you. That's critically important.
Is Mitt Romney such a mentor to you?
He has been. I am really grateful for the time I had to work with him. And we continue to remain in touch. And I think very, very highly of him. And he's been extremely influential in my own career. And certainly has been a big figure in my life.
You were only 34 when you were chief policy advisor for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. How did you develop such a close relationship with Romney since you were just barely out of school at the time?
We, I worked on he ran for president twice. In 2008, I worked on his campaign the first time. And, during that first campaign, I got to know him, and I think he got to know me a little bit too, and I think we both appreciated the ability to, we had very similar views on policy in a lot of ways, but also we're able to communicate with one another in a way that suggested that we could really get along. And as he decided to run for president the second time, I went back to join that effort, and we really, built trust over time, I think. Got to know each other to the point where I think by the end of the campaign I was really able to anticipate what he would think about certain things and what his view would be. And I think having that insight about somebody is helpful, but also being able to earn their trust is really important.
Yeah, that's difficult too, just purely based on work.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. We had a very strong working relationship, and I think that he trusted that I would get him the information he needed to make the right decisions. And that was something that I always prided myself on, was being able to make sure that I was giving him everything he needed to make the right decisions.
好，这个陈仁仪先生呢，也是说到他作为一个华裔的身份出现在美国政坛呢，其实也说明美国体系的这样一种开放性，重视的呢不是你的肤色和族裔，而是你个人的品格和能力。他也跟我们就是强调说，为什么能够跟罗姆尼有这么好的一个合作，就是来源于他通过自己的这个工作获得了对方的信任。只要是获得了对方的信任，就是可能也对他的工作将来就是会非常的有帮助。
我觉得他这个一个非常好的示范作用就是，他的确提出就是，其实在美国政坛内部，他根本不是很在意你是不是华裔，是不是黑人或者是什么的，他更在意的是你的个人的能力是怎样的。
对，
就像他大学这个刚毕业，就是博士刚毕业的话，他可能开始以志愿者的身份，或者是一个专业的这种consult 的这种身份进入到这个 ROM 的这个竞选团队，但是在这个团队中，他可以逐渐靠自己的能力获得这个 ROM 的注意和重视，逐渐然后升到他的这个政策主任的这个地位，所以他完全是靠。真的是靠个人努力，而不是说靠我爹呀、我爸认识谁呀，然后把我拉进去啊，完全没有这个迹象。
对，但是其实除了能力方面，大家对他为什么选择共和党也有一些疑问，因为我们知道共和党传统上是一直跟这个比较亲近台湾的，所以我们也非常好奇他是不是因为这个原因，包括他的台裔移民的身份，才选择了共和党。
听说他的这个英文名字也就是一个台语的这个翻译，是吧？叫做什么？叫做 Lan， 对 Lan He 就是一个台语的发音。
他的这个台语的发音，然后而且我觉得很奇怪，一般这个像第二代移民都会取一个什么 David 什么Tom 什么这种，但是他这个发音
保留了浓重的台味，这是为什么？好，我们也听听他对于美国对台湾的政策有没有一些他个人很有个性的分析和解读。
I know a lot of Taiwanese Americans become Republicans because they believe Republicans are the strongest supporter of Taiwan. Was that part of the reason?
No, that the issue of U.S.-Taiwan relations was not really something that animated my perspective on U.S. politics early on. I really felt more strongly about the U.S. domestic policy issues. But I do believe that over time, Republicans have been strong friends of Taiwan. And that's something that I think Taiwan has benefited from over the years.
Some would say that you're closer to Taiwan and, close to Taiwan, far from China, because you're from Taiwan and your parents are from Taiwan, and, your views might be more hawkish towards China. What would you say to that?
Well, first of all, I don't think that that's true. I mean, first and foremost, I see myself as an American, and so my interests are going to be what the American interests are. Obviously,
so that's your identity, right?
My identity is American.
Yourself, right?
Yeah, it's American. Now, obviously, I'm of Taiwanese heritage. I've spent a lot of time in Taiwan. As a child growing up, I spent a lot of time there. Have relatives there still. But I've also had the occasion to go to China much more recently. In fact, I'm going to China later this week. And so I can appreciate what China is trying to do. On the other hand, I think what Taiwan has been able to accomplish is impressive as well. And so I think it's fair to say that I have soft spots in my heart for Taiwan, but also increasingly for what's happening in China as well. And so I'm not sure it's fair to say that I am somehow substantially closer to Taiwan because that's what happens to be my heritage.
Yes.
But first and foremost, I would think of myself as an American.
What kind of role do you think that U.S. should play in the cross-strait relations?
Well, I think the U.S. has reinforced its belief in the One China policy, and I think that continues to be the right position for the U.S. to have. I think that the U.S. also has committed to assisting Taiwan in a number of different ways, and I think the U.S. should abide by that commitment as well. But, my understanding of what's happened is that actually the two sides have managed to develop a number of greater economic ties over the last few years. There's a lot more tourism between Taiwan and China. There are many Chinese that have come to Taiwan to study. And I think those are all good things. I know that some in Taiwan resist that, and there's been some discussion about whether that's healthy or not. But ultimately, more interaction between two people, two parties can be positive. I mean, it's almost like there's an old saying that if two parties are interacting and they're trading with one another, they're probably not going to go to war with one another. And so I think that that's probably a positive.
But if push comes to shove, what the U.S. Do you think the U.S. would stand by Taiwan's side, given of the growing ties with China?
Yeah, I mean it's a tough question. I think that the U.S. as a matter of policy is certainly committed to doing that. I think the U.S. would do everything it could to intervene before it got there. But I certainly think that if, as you say, if push came to shove, I think the U.S. commitment to Taiwan has been clear. And will continue to be clear as expressed through various administrations. But the reality is, I think that relationship, the relationship between Taiwan and China has become one of mutual understanding and cooperation over the last couple of years. And so one hopes that can continue. And
yes,
that the issue won't be as significant anymore in terms of what the U.S. would need to do in that situation.
你看他的这个口气吧，跟当时我们聊骆家辉的时候口气如出一辙。不管在哪儿，我是哪儿的后裔，我都是美国人，我代表是美国的这个利益。哎，倒是我印象很深刻的就是我们有一个问题也挺尖锐的，说如果真的是关系恶化哈，那大陆对美国来说又越来越重要。美国到底是该支持台湾呢，还是支持大陆呢？他自己其实回答的也挺官方的，
他比较油滑，
他说：“哎呀，这个。”
但他首先揭示，因为共和党的确一贯他只说这个跟台湾的关系是非常的密切的，而且美国他是清楚的制定有这个政府对台法案，然后规定好了，如果一旦发生这种不幸的事件的时候应该会怎么做。但他又强调说，从现实角度来说，他觉得这种可能性越来越低，这种情况出现的可能性几乎已经微乎其微了。而且美国也是会一定是回避了这个问题，使尽全力去阻止会发生这样的一个不会走到这么一危险的境地。哎，还有一个问题说，是不是近台湾而远大陆？他其实原则就是说我代表的是美国利益，就无所谓大陆和台湾，其实都不是我们自己，意思就是是吧？他最近的还是美国自己。对，好，那紧接着我们要来听到的是本次访谈我觉得是最大头也是最重要的一部分内容哈，就是美国对华政策他又是怎么看的。我们回来之后来继续聆听下一段的专访。
Radio, more than radio.
好的，欢迎回到三点话新闻，我是樊素，
我是春雨，
我是圆圆。
我们继续来聆听我们的执行台长 Carol 对于陈仁仪先生，也就是美国共和党的政治新星的专访。那谈到中美关系呢，大家可能会有这么一个一厢情愿的联想哈，作为一个华裔，他似乎呢对于大陆或者对于台湾呢，他应该是有一种天然的亲近才对，但是恰恰相反。
对他之前他其实一直被媒体这个标榜是鹰派， 因为他当时助选 Romney 的时候呢，他曾经就是表示这个对中国要很强硬的态度啊，什么这个汇率啊，这个货币政策方面都是对中国提出了非常严厉的批评的。但是他其实借助这个专访，他也给自己打了一架圆场。现在就是他已经脱离了 Romney 的团队，他说
那是他说的，
那是 Romney 的言论，我要代表他，但是现在我说的是我自己的。
好，来听听具体他是怎么表述的。
And some would suspect or say that you probably want to be extra tough on China to show that you're completely in line with U.S. national interests. What would you say to that?
Well, I think it's important for the U.S. to have a constructive relationship with China. During the 2012 campaign, I spoke often on the issue of China, but it was as a representative of Governor Romney and of his campaign. And so it's important in a campaign setting that you are completely in line and saying what the candidate's views are. My own view is that it's a tough relationship, and it has to be one that has the combination of a constructive engagement, but also areas where the U.S. needs to be very clear about what its interests are and what's important to it. And so I think it's a very nuanced relationship. I think it's a difficult one. My sense is that I have great sympathy for what Taiwan has been able to. I have great admiration for what Taiwan's been able to accomplish. I also have sympathy for the challenges that government has now. But ultimately, I think the Sino-U.S. relationship is incredibly important to the future of both of our countries.
Can we interpret it as like a lot of what you said during the Romney campaign was more campaign rhetoric rather than really a view?
Well, it was certainly, I think it was a point of view. It was Governor Romney's point of view, not necessarily always my point of view. But it's hard in a campaign because things get very heated very quickly. And the rhetoric a lot of times can be maybe a little bit beyond what you're comfortable with in a different setting. And so I think that's one of the things one has to be careful of in U.S. politics. I think that to Governor Romney's credit, he always was able to keep it in a reasonable level. But there are some U.S. campaigns that go way over the edge when it comes to China bashing and things like that.
Yeah, I think many in China don't understand why there's always a wave of China bashing, especially during presidential campaigns. What was the fundamental understanding behind that?
Well, the reality is, in many parts of the United States, China isn't very popular. There's a perception that jobs are being lost to China. There's a perception that we're losing in an economic battle with China. And I think those are sentiments that are very real amongst people in some parts of the U.S. It is concerning, though, because, as I said, going forward, the U.S. and China have to engage in a constructive relationship. It's important for both countries to do that. And so I think what animates it is that in U.S. politics, both Republicans and Democrats realize that China won't be the most popular country, particularly during times of vigorous elections being contested. And so I think there's a desire to speak to that during campaigns.
And I feel sad too. There's always this, mistrust between the two great countries, and every country has this propaganda way of getting its message to the public.
Right.
And a lot of the public get influenced by that.
Right.
And I try to bring a lot of American friends over to China and show them what China really is over the years. And I feel that they develop a different view about China, after visiting themselves.
Yeah.
What do you think we can do about this, deep mistrust between the two sides?
I think part of it has to do with greater exchange, cultural exchange between the Chinese and the U.S. So I think that's very important. But I also think that both governments can probably do a better job of strategically engaging in areas where there can be some agreement. Now, there'll be some areas where the U.S. and China are just not going to agree. And in those areas, the countries will continue to have different interests. But, the U.S., even with its strongest allies, has disagreements, and so those are natural. But I think the cultural exchanges help, and I think media helps too. Honestly, for the American people to see more Chinese or Asian faces on U.S. TV or in U.S. Newspapers or on U.S. radio, I think that can help to demonstrate that Asian Americans are more mainstream, and that will help the relationship.
In what areas do you think that the two sides can pragmatically work on to improve the relationship?
Well, I think certainly there are some tricky areas where we know there's going to be difficulty, like currency. But on trade, for example, there may be areas where we can constructively work together to improve both access for U.S. companies, but also protect the interests that China has in that regard. I think we could certainly work together on public health challenges, potentially, going forward. And I think we can work together as we think about the challenges that we face from terrorism and the rise of global Islamic jihadism. I think both countries, the U.S. faces the challenge more acutely than China does, but China is not necessarily immune from it either. And so I think the two countries can certainly have better cooperation in that way as well.
But during the 2012 Romney campaign, Romney has taken a very strong stance against China. A lot of it might be campaign rhetoric, but he does want to put, punitive tariffs on China. And he said that, even if he comes to office, that's like the first thing that he would do. Do you think that by taking a stronger stance towards China, it will actually be constructive, or China will actually give in?
Well, I think in some areas it's important for the U.S. to express its point of view. And it may be the case that that doesn't necessarily constructively work in terms of moving the relationship with China forward, but the U.S. has got to express its point of view, because if it doesn't, then there may be a misunderstanding, or there may not be clarity on where the U.S. stands. In other areas, the nuance is important, and expressing that point of view in a nuanced way is important. But ultimately, I do think that the U.S. has to be forceful on the things it really cares about. So, currency may be one of those issues it really cares about. Intellectual property may be another issue it really cares strongly about, and then potentially human rights as well. I think the U.S. Needs to be forceful where it believes strongly, and where there's room for negotiation, it needs to actively and constructively engage.
But I guess the two countries come from very different cultural backgrounds and philosophies.
Yes.
In China, people always feel like, you shouldn't be intervening in my domestic issues, while the U.S. feels that, this is the better way of doing things and wants to expand my philosophies. How do the two sides meet in the middle?
That's part of the challenge on human rights in particular, because it is for China fundamentally a domestic issue. They believe it's something that they have the ability and the right to handle on their own. For the U.S., though, it's part of the promotion of the values that Americans care about. And one of those values is respect for human life, and respect for the freedoms that individuals have to express themselves. And so I think the U.S. is always going to stand for those things, and it's always going to feel like it should stand for those things, and it's going to cause conflict sometimes. And in the case of China, it definitely has and will.
And Xi Jinping, after he came to power, he came up with this new notion of a new model of great power relations between the U.S. and China. And a lot of people interpret as that he wants equal footing of China with U.S. on the international stage. Even though the world is large enough, is the U.S. prepared to share the world stage with another country?
Well, I think the U.S. has to realize, and I think it does, that it is a world stage where increasingly there are competing philosophies and competing ideals. China is a great economic power, and it has been for some time now. And I think the U.S. certainly recognizes that. I think part of the challenge, though, is what's the U.S. response to that? Part of the U.S. response might be, well, we want to shy away from expressing our perspective because there are other competitors, if you will, that are just as strong. The other perspective is to say, no, actually, it's more of a reason for the U.S. to stand for the values that it's always stood for. So I think the U.S. is ready to see China in that way. I think the question now will be how the U.S. will deal with China going forward.
How do you think the U.S. will deal with China going forward?
Well, I think part of it has to be a recognition that China has its own national interests, and those interests a lot of times may not align with the U.S. And, I think the U.S. has to pick its spots, if you will, areas where it's going to engage with them, areas where it's going to say, okay, we recognize that we're just going to have a difference of opinion on this, and identifying, as I said earlier, areas of cooperation and really working through that. But it's a very challenging relationship for the U.S. It has been for some time now, and I think that it could only become more challenging if they're not able to really focus in on a couple of areas of agreement, and also continue to express the U.S. point of view forcefully where they want to.
What do you think are the top priorities for U.S. national interests in terms of dealing with China?
Well, certainly the growth of the Chinese economy and a marketplace for U.S. companies to enter, but also the ability of there to be free commerce between the two. So I think that is both a challenge and an opportunity. And I think on the other side, the military issues are also significant, particularly as China ramps up its military development, increasing size of its navy, etc. And also some of these skirmishes that we've seen, whether in the South China Sea or East China Sea, those have the potential to become really significant battles and really potentially blowing up into things that no one wants them to blow up into. Those are things that the U.S., I think, has to be more actively involved in, mediating disputes, helping people figure out how to avoid conflict, because unfortunately it's gotten pretty significant what's happening in South China Sea.
There have been a lot of frictions, especially in this year. And I guess Obama's pivot to Asia policy has put China on the nerve as well, since China regards the U.S. as intervening in its regional issues, in the neighborhood, and intervening this way. What do you think that Obama tries to achieve through its pivot to Asia policy?
Well, I think the idea was to emphasize the importance of Asia. And you recall when Secretary Hillary Clinton announced the policy, she talked about this being a Pacific century. And I think that that's right to a certain degree, in the sense that the nations of Asia are going to be increasingly important as the U.S. thinks about who it's interacting with going forward. There was also this notion that once the U.S. started to pull back from Iraq and Afghanistan and involvement in the Middle East, there was going to be extra resources and availability to commit to Asia. Unfortunately, I think there's been a lot more talk than actual execution of the pivot, because for a variety of different reasons we've continued to focus on the Middle East.
I guess from people in Asia's perspective, the U.S. has a lot of hot issues, in Middle East and Europe. Why focus on Asia? You have a big deficit budget. You have cut your defense budget. And you have a lot of things going on in Middle East and Europe already. Why Asia?
Well, there's a sense that economically the future of the U.S. is largely tied to the future of Asia, whether it's China, whether it's traditional markets like Korea and Japan, or new markets like Thailand and Burma and Vietnam. I think that for the U.S., Asia is a critically important piece as we think about U.S. foreign policy going in the future. So yes, while it may certainly be the case that traditionally the U.S. has been more involved in the Middle East or in Europe, Asia is critically important, and I think people realize it.
Do you think the U.S. needs China more in this sense, economically?
I think in some ways, the relationship with China is such that they do have the upper hand in some ways when it comes to the economic situation. Which is not to say that the U.S., the future is hopeless in terms of being able to regain some balance in that relationship. I just think that, unfortunately, with the U.S. economy continuing to stagnate relative to where I think it should be, it's difficult. I think China has really gained the upper hand in a lot of ways when we think about the economic interaction with the U.S.
So from the Chinese perspective, economically, they think that they have the upper hand, and the U.S. is intervening in the neighborhood, as you said. If you were the Chinese counterpart, how would you react to these kind of intervention per se or policy?
Yeah, I can understand why the Chinese are skeptical of the U.S. I think the difficult thing is that from the Chinese perspective, I think the Chinese feel like they have the right and the ability to control things that happen in their neighborhood. And the U.S. is perceived as being someone who's meddling in things that they really shouldn't be meddling in. The challenge from the U.S. perspective is that I think the U.S. feels like they have definite interests in supporting allies like Korea and Japan in the region, in continuing the economic development in the Southeast Asian area, but also ensuring freedom of commerce and navigation in the seas. And so those are all values that are very important to the U.S. And I don't know, maybe both sides need a better understanding of what the other is trying to accomplish.
Yeah, this sort of, when you look at Asia now, it looks like a 19th century, old strategic rivalry kind of scene rather than the 21st century, new model of great power relations in a sense. So it's quite dangerous in a sense.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you go back to what's happening in the South China Sea with some of the skirmishes around the Scarborough Shoal and other parts of other islands and things like that, and then what's happening in the East China Sea as well, those do have the potential to really animate a severe conflict between great powers. And one hopes it doesn't. But I think it takes more active engagement on the part of the United States than we've seen thus far.
好，这一段的信息量非常
巨大的
丰富哈。
对，
我挑几个我印象很深的一些重点吧。一个呢，就是说到罗姆尼，你说之前选举的时候对于中国政策哈，他的表态这么的强硬。Carol 这句问的挺好的，那是不是选举言论真实反映着他的个人的观点？他说这个其实也不是，因为很多人大选的时候呢，他会提出压制中国论，他为的什么呢？就是赢得选票，说明说这样的一种言论在美国是大有市场的。那紧接着问题也来，为什么美国人这么喜欢听这种压制中国的言论？那他也回答了说，因为中国在美国很多地方呢不受欢迎，比如说美国人的工作被中国人抢了，美国的经济也在被中国打败着，这是美国人的这个真实的感受，也确实让人担心，
有点酸溜溜是吧？
对，
但其实现在已经改变了，就是很多中国人现在中国的厂家已经到美国去投资，他们已经很欢迎中国人过去了，因为创造就业机会了，反而。
对，还有讲到这个春雨，你印象有哪些方面？
他也提到说，中美的这个文化背景的不同，其实在中美关系中扮演了一个可以说是反作用，就是比如说大家对人权的理解呀，等等等等，都造成了一些不同，反而给中美造成了一些冲突。但是他更重要的是，他提出了一些将来中美可以合作的方向，就比如说这个公共医疗啊、反恐啊等等。确实，像公共医疗政策，中美要是合作的话，我觉得空间还真的是很大。
说到最近已经有2个美资的这个医院要在中国落地，就是在中国开美资的医院了。
对，确实纯美资的医院，也许能给中国的医疗体系改革带来一些
来挣中国人的钱嘛。
对，
奥巴马 care 到中国人来挣钱。
你看你们已经开始关心具体政策制定了，但是我更关心2016到底谁主沉浮。尽管你看现在共和党似乎风头非常劲但是真的意味着16年他们就能够获得大权吗？其实这还并不一定。我们再来听听陈先生对于美国大选2年之后美国政坛主导者他有什么样的预测吗？三联话新闻稍后回来继续。好的，欢迎回到3D 话新闻，我是樊素，
我是春雨，
我是圆圆。
我们继续来聆听今天专访的这位嘉宾是来自于美国共和党的政坛新星，他呢有一个很特别的身份，就是华裔，他叫做陈仁仪。
第二代。
紧接着听听他对于这个美国2016的总统大选有没有一些前瞻性的预测，比如说每一个党的这个党内初选他比较看好谁
？Do you think that he would run again for the 2016 presidential campaign?
I think he's been pretty clear that he doesn't want to be a candidate and that he's not a candidate now. And so I take him at his word. But I think our campaign here for the Republican nomination in 2016 will be a very interesting one. And there'll be a lot of people who will get in and some will stay out. And ultimately, we'll watch and see what happens.
And it will be a tough battle too, because if Hillary Clinton wins this time around for the Democratic Party nomination, she's going to be a very, very strong candidate to beat.
She will be, and I think she's got a lot of strengths, but I also think that she has a lot of flaws, and whoever the Republican nominee is going to be able to have to be able to expose those flaws. And
what do you think are her main flaws?
Well, I think, one of the big things is, with the Obama foreign policy being seen from the U.S. so negatively, she was Secretary of State for several years, and so she's going to be associated with the Obama foreign policy. And she's going to have to
trying
figure
to
out how
distance herself now, right, from
yeah,
Obama.
but she's not going to be able to do that. She was a part of his administration, and she's going to have to own her service in that way. So I think that will be a challenge for her. I think she's got some issues connecting with people. You know, I think she lost a campaign in 2008, you may recall, when she ran against Barack Obama for the Democratic nomination. She lost a campaign that she should have won. And I think that a lot of those traits about her inability to connect with people is going to continue to be difficult for her.
Do you think Romney has the same problem as well?
You know, I think there was a perception that he did. I certainly think that people found him to be an honest, genuine person when they got to know him. But the challenge is in politics. When you're campaigning to 300 million people, it's hard for them to get to know you real well. And so I think the challenge is that oftentimes there was a caricature of Romney that wasn't very flattering, and it's unfortunate because that's not who he is.
What do you think are the top issues for the 2016 campaign?
I think the economy is always an important issue and will be in 2016. What the U.S. economy does over the next couple years will be very important, whether the unemployment rate continues to go down or whether it starts to go back up, and whether the growth rate goes up. I think the economy will be a big issue. I think healthcare is an issue that will always be something that people will talk about, particularly with Obamacare and the continued implementation.
And your specialty.
Yeah, that's something I spent a lot of time thinking about, And then foreign policy, I think, will be something that people will talk about because of Hillary Clinton, in part. Because she was Secretary of State, foreign policy is going to be much more of an issue. Now, I think in some ways it'll be very difficult for whoever the Republican is to talk about foreign policy because they won't have shared the experience. Right. She's been Secretary of State, she's been there to make the decisions, and Republicans, by and large, haven't been. And so that will be a challenge, for sure.
别看这一段内容不是很长哈，但是真正的是有亮点的。比如说他开始公开的说这个民主党的希拉里，大家似乎都闻出来他有意角逐2016总统宝座的这么一个意欲哈。说他呀这个有很多的优势，但是也有很明显的缺点，就是说呢他的这个人际关系上是有问题，就是感觉跟普通的民众啊感觉非常的遥远。而且呢你别看他希拉里出书，现在不是他专门在书里面批评奥巴马的这个外交政策吧，你乍一看似乎是想跟他自己撇开关系的，但实际上呢你看陈仁仪就说他不能置身事外，对，因为奥巴马的外交政策他作为当时的这个国务卿的话，他也是有他的责任的，
他是其中的一部分，而且他是执行面，很多都是他去执行的，他肯定不能够撇清的。
而且他也说在2016大选经济政策肯定是一个重头戏，包括其实有人就说奥巴马这次在民主党为什么在这个中期选举里根本会一败涂地，他的根本原因就在于经济。因为我看到一些数据，它就显示说在奥巴马在任期间，虽然金融危机已经过去了5年多，美国经济的数据也一直在生长，甚至这个股市翻了3倍， GDP 也增长超过了1万亿，但是人们的薪水其实没有增加。而且在通货膨胀以后，7月份就是今年7月份最新数据，美国家庭收入中它的总收入比07年的12月其实还每个家庭低了2600美元，所以其实经济上真的是没有多少起色，起码没有让这些老百姓尝到什么甜头。
这个我有意思的是，我去问了一下我那些住在美国的这些同学们，他们呢这个绝大部分的受过高等教育都是双博士之类的家庭，
双博士
对，都是支持什么呢？支持共和党，尤其是在这个加州的。非常支持共和党。这次这个美国的华人组织一个义工团体，然后去帮这个加州共和党去拉选票，从众院到参院的这个选票的时候都是帮助他们的。
那他们觉得现在共和党谁最有希望成为这个候选人吗？有聊这个吗？
没有聊这个，我主要是问为什么。他们主要其实就是
中期选举这次，
对，针对的就是那一次，就是这个大学针对这个有点排华这个反这个肤色法案，就是不再给这个倾向这个亚裔学生的这个scholarship 奖学金的问题了。
你看他的这个强调哈，陈仁仪还是说呢，2016年的大选，刚才春雨也讲的，经济政策永远都是 重中之重，
永远是美国的，
永远都是重中之重。但是现在呢，也问题可能还早一些。尽管说中期选举结束，紧接着大家就开始准备16年的这个大选了。但是现在似乎，你看，我们第一个问题就是问到罗姆尼他会不会继续参加这个16年的总统大选，第5次再参加。他说这个已经很清楚表明他是不会再参选了，
第3次再
不会再参选了。而且呢，这个希拉里刚才也说到了，他是批评他。那么罗姆尼是不是也有跟希拉里一样的人际关系方面的问题？似乎是这种大富是吧？我看有人专门梳理他的这个资产，说已经有几亿美金，这种富豪他天然的就跟普通的草根阶层是有距离的嘛？
也不是，我觉得其实是这样，就是民主党一贯来说，它倾向社会主义，它提供很多这个国家福利给穷人，所以他在这个方面他去广拉选票。
对，
而共和党呢，他更倾向于这个，他相信市场的力量，相信资本主义，而且包括陈仁英他说，相信个人的责任，多于这个政府的管理。
所以可能政治方面这个意识形态，它就是有重大的区别的，
对，非常大的区别的。
这个非常的有意思哈。那尽管说现在我们看到这个共和党似乎参众两院已经是达到这个一统天下的格局，但是美国历来有这么一个习惯，就是说呢，民意是要平衡的。未来有可能2年之后，最后的总统还是由民主党获得，这个也不一定。我们一起再来静观其变。好，非常感谢大家收听今天的节目，我是樊素，
我是春雨，
我是圆圆，
拜拜。